My name is Dr. Randall Davis. I am co-director of international wildlife research with my colleague, Dr. Terry Williams. Today, I will be reviewing contingency planning and response for an oil spill involving sea otters in Washington state. Before we start, we might ask, why is contingency planning and response required for an oil spill involving sea otters? Sea otters are the only marine mammal that relies exclusively on fur for thermal insulation in water. Most other marine mammals rely on blubber. Most of the insulation in the fur results from air trapped between the hairs. Contact with oil displaces the air layer and eliminates most of the thermal insulation, which causes lethal hypothermia. Sea otters that have more than 20% of their fur oiled, especially with crude oil, will die from complications associated with hypothermia unless they are captured, cleaned, and rehabilitated. Let's review two historical events that led to oiled sea otter response planning in Alaska and California. The 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill was the first large spill involving the capture and rehabilitation of oiled animals, primarily seabirds. However, the risk to sea otters to the north of the spill was apparent. Approximately 3.8 million gallons of crude oil were released off the coast of California, and this resulted in the death of an estimated 3,500 seabirds, as well as an unknown number of elephant seals, sea lions, and possibly some cetaceans. This seminal event led to the modern environmental movement and federal legislation, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Water Act. The first spill involving sea otters occurred on March 24th, 1989, with the grounding of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, which spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into Prince William Sound, Alaska. An estimated 5,000 sea otters and 30,000 seabirds were killed. At that time, there were no contingency plans, rehabilitation facilities, or trained responders for oiled sea otters. Based on the research that my colleague Terry Williams and I had conducted in the 1980s to develop methods to clean and rehabilitate oiled sea otters, the U.S. Department of Interior requested that we organize an oiled sea otter response in which 220 oiled sea otters were ultimately rehabilitated and released. In 1994, Dr. Williams and I formed International Wildlife Research, or IWR, to provide contingency planning, training, and response for oil spills involving sea otters and other fur-bearing marine mammals. Today, IWR is the guaranteed responder for oiled sea otters for Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, with a 200 oiled sea otter response capability for Prince William Sound, Alaska. So what is IWR? It's an organization of biologists, veterinarians, veterinary technicians, and trained responders with expertise in the capture, care, and rehabilitation of oiled sea otters, with 32 years of experience, and the only organization with experience responding to an oil spill involving large numbers of sea otters. The purpose of IWR is to provide training, contingency planning, capture, and rehabilitation of oiled sea otters to private industry and federal and state trustee agencies. The goal of this presentation is to provide an overview of primary requirements for the capture and rehabilitation of sea otters in the event of an oil spill in Washington state. The goal of any oiled sea otter response is to be operational within 72 hours using trained wildlife responders. Information for oiled sea otter response. was based on the research that Dr. Williams and I conducted in the 1980s, in which we developed a method to clean oiled sea otters, and the lessons that we learned from the 1989 Valdez oil spill. And these were published in a book in 1995 titled Emergency Care and Rehabilitation of Oiled Sea Otters, a guide for large and small spills involving fur-bearing marine mammals. A PDF of this book is available free on our website at wildliferesearch.com. This book became the blueprint for organizing an oiled sea otter response program for Alaska in the early 1990s and is relevant for Washington State. So what are the components of a response plan? Well, it consists of contingency planning and permitting, training and staffing, and this can be divided into two parts: capture and transport, and the rehabilitation of a facility. And finally, facilities, equipment, and supplies. With regards to contingency planning and permits, to be successful, a unified response plan must include oiled sea otter capture, transport, and rehabilitation, and be fully implemented in 72 hours. A pre-authorized permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to capture, transport, and rehabilitate sea otters is needed for immediate response capability. Trying to get a permit once a spill has occurred can delay the response a significant amount of time. IWR has a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit to transport and rehabilitate oiled sea otters in Washington State. An amendment to include sea otter capture is being filed at the request of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Training responders before a spill is essential for a 72-hour response capability. Training is divided between two groups of responders: capture and transport, and rehabilitation. This is necessary because of the different skills and HAZWOPER training requirements for these two groups. Annual refreshers are required by OSHA, that is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, for HAZWOPER training for all oil spill responders. A combination of online and classroom training is possible, which includes HAZWOPER certification as required by OSHA. IWR uses their open access training website at wildliferesearch.com and annual classroom training. Responders who complete the training are placed on a roster and can be called into service in the event of a spill. IWR has been training capture and rehabilitation responders for over 20 years in Alaska and has a roster of over 200 participants. Capture and transport responders require specialized skills for sea otter handling and boat operation. These are some images from a ConocoPhillips wildlife response drill in Alaska and the 1989 Valdez spill. Alyeska has over 30 fishing vessels under contract to respond immediately in the event of an oil spill involving sea otters. These fishing vessels act as mother vessels that transport crews and other supplies to the spill site. When these vessels are called up, they go to Port Valdez and have capture equipment that has been pre-staged in fish totes loaded onto their boats so that they can be on site within 12 to 24 hours. These mother vessels then use smaller skiffs to capture oiled sea otters which are often lethargic and only required to be dip netted out of the water using a salmon dip net. Once the otter is captured, it is placed into a kennel cage and taken back to the mother vessel, where these otters are stabilized and then transported to the rehabilitation facility, either by a boat or aircraft. The number of responders will depend on the number of oiled sea otters, the geographic extent of the spill, and the distance from the spill to the rehabilitation center. Helicopter transport may be required depending on distance to the spill, which is what we used during the 1989 Valdez oil spill. IWR currently trains crews for over 30 capture and transport vessels for Alyeska Pipeline Service Company in Alaska. These fishing vessels are under contract to respond immediately in the event of a spill, and they are authorized to capture oiled sea otters under a U.S. Fish and Wildlife permit to IWR. With regards to the rehabilitation facility, the number of professional staff and trained responders will depend on the number of oiled sea otters. A 10 sea otter response for Washington State could involve 30 to 50 professional staff, trained responders, and support staff. Generally, 2 to 3 shifts are required for 24-hour care. However, during the 1989 Valdez spill in Alaska, involving over 320 oiled sea otters, IWR employed 300 staff divided into 2 shifts. Facilities for the rehabilitation of oiled sea otters may be either dedicated or disseminated among aquaria. However, the rehabilitation facility should be designed as a flow-through system in which oiled sea otters are rehabilitated within 1 to 3 weeks, depending on other health parameters. Ideally, the facilities have pens and pools with seawater, although freshwater can be used. This is the floor plan for the sea otter rehabilitation facility in Alaska, owned and operated by IWR for Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. It is designed to handle up to 200 oiled sea otters. It is a modular design involving 16 40-foot connexes that can be stored when not needed, but assembled and made operational in 72 hours. When sea otters arrive at the facility, they are taken into a triage and sedation area for initial evaluation. If deemed suitable, fit for cleaning, they are moved into the cleaning area. After cleaning, they're moved to a drying area to dry the fur, and then into a recovery and stabilization area for observation. This facility also includes a veterinary clinic, a nursery area for orphaned sea otter pups, which, by the way, are very time-consuming, and a necropsy lab to necropsy all otters that die in the facility. And normally we take histology and toxicology samples for analysis. Responders enter through a side door where they pick up their PPE, personal protective equipment, before they go to their stations. And as I mentioned, this facility can be made operational in 72 hours. These are some images from this facility. Here is the admissions area for arriving otters. The triage area where the otters are evaluated by the veterinarians and veterinary technicians. They can then move into the cleaning area. We have stainless steel tables with overhead mixing valves of hot and cold water for the cleaning process, which takes about an hour. They then move to a drying area where blowers are used to dry the fur, and then into a recovery area for observation by the vets and vet techs. This is the veterinary clinic. Obviously, it does not have the equipment and supplies that would be present if there were a spill. This is a small food prep area, although most food prep occurs off-site. This is the necropsy lab. These modules are assembled in a warehouse with interconnecting hallways. After the otters are cleaned and dried, they will remain in recovery and observation. What the vets and vet techs are looking for are the signs that the otters can now be moved out of the facility and into holding pens with pools. And what they're looking for is that the animal be alert, have a normal body temperature of about 37 degrees, that they are feeding, and that there are no other health issues. Once those criteria are met, they are moved out of the rehabilitation facilities to tote pens. This is what they look like. These were designed based on our experience in the 1989 Valdez spill. It can hold 2 otters at a time. It has a small haul out and a pool. We can clean the fur of sea otters. We can remove the oil. However, the fur can still be wetted. It is up to the otters to groom and felt their fur so that the air layer is reestablished next to the skin. This means that the otter has to be healthy enough to groom, and it is a delicate balance because the grooming has to take place in water, but the otter cannot become chilled. So we usually are monitoring these animals. They move in and out of the water. They actively groom their fur, and you can see the air layer being restored. Fur becomes noticeably different in appearance. Once that air layer is restored, then the otter is fully rehabilitated if all other health parameters check out. At this point, the otters can be moved to a pre-release facility. A pre-release facility is required because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service may not be ready to immediately release rehabilitated otters. This is what happened in 1989 in Alaska, in which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service required over a month to develop a release plan. During that period, we held 220 otherwise healthy sea otters, caring for them and feeding them. That may happen in Washington State. Pre-release facilities can include pools, such as that shown here, or holding pens. Obviously, the water coming into these pools and pens has to be clean, and there has to be personnel to feed and monitor the otters. A warehouse is often helpful in which to store supplies and equipment when the facility is not operational. This is the warehouse in Port Valdez, Alaska, where all of the equipment and supplies are stored in totes in a warehouse so that they can be mobilized within 24 hours as the facility comes up to speed. If the distance from the spill to the rehabilitation facility is far, approximately greater than a 3-hour transport duration, a mobile facility may be needed to stabilize sea otters prior to transport to the rehabilitation facility. These are images of Alyeska's mobile sea otter and bird stabilization modules. They are small connexes that can be set up on land or on a boat. They consist of an area that will receive the oiled otters so that they can be initially evaluated and held out of the weather until they are ready for transport to the rehabilitation facility. The design of these modules can differ quite a bit. This is a mobile module, stabilization module, that IWR designed in the early 2000s. And it might be most appropriate for Washington State. IWR is pre-authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to transport, rehabilitate, and release oiled sea otters in Washington State for a rapid spill response. Our plan would include annual personnel training and HAZWOPER certification with a roster of wildlife professionals, veterinarians, veterinarian technicians, and responders. A state, industry, or private rehabilitation facility will be required that can be made operational in 72 hours. Capture vessels and crews have to be pre-trained and OSHA certified, and then refresher certification is needed on a semi-annual basis. Periodic drills and training exercises are helpful. And IWR uses state-of-the-art techniques based on scientific research. IWR has the expertise and experience to organize and operate an oiled sea otter response involving capture, transport, and rehabilitation. And IWR is pre-authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to transport and rehabilitate oiled sea otters in Washington State. During a spill, IWR would partner with International Bird Rescue, which is an improved wildlife response service provider, as well as aquaria and other marine mammal stranding programs. A PDF of this presentation is available on request at this email address.